So neither form of scientism adequately allows one to state and defend the necessary presuppositions that justify practicing science. So in chapter 4, he's highlighted one of the fundamental ironies of this discussion, namely that scientism is not science, but it's philosophy, right? You're not able to do science on that statement, and therefore we move from the category of science, the hard sciences, to one of epistemology or of philosophy, our act of knowing, our ability to know things, if we can know things. Can we know things? Well, that itself is a question that we can ask, and to ask it means that we can probably know things, right? So that's the fun part about philosophy. So now we can go a step further and say that not only is scientism not science, again, as defined by the scientists themselves, it is not even a friend of science, but rather its enemy. And therefore, the danger sneaks in here of the subtitle.
Yeah. So scientism kind of, if you hold to that position, it pretty much destroys science, right? Because now it's saying that, the statement of scientism is false. And therefore, what does that do to science, right? So that's what he means, I think, by its enemy here. That's part of what he means. All right, he goes on then, and he wants to now kind of zero in on the philosophical presuppositions that science has to adhere to, or at least hold to, in order to, accomplish the things that it accomplishes. And so he entitles this section, "The Conclusions of Science Can Only Be as Strong as Its Presuppositions," right? The assumptions that the scientists are making. And so he says that science cannot be practiced in thin air, right? It's based on many assumptions, each with its challenges. And so the business of stating and criticizing and defending its assumptions, notice, is not scientific, but philosophical. Right. And so what he's going to do in the rest of this chapter is to show that there are some assumptions and there's disagreement on these assumptions. And so on either side, you have to make philosophical arguments about these assumptions of science. And again, that is not doing science, that's doing philosophy. Right. That's what he's getting at.
Right. Yeah, science is not made ex nihilo in there. Well, just as the structure of a building cannot be more reliable than the foundation on which it rests, so the conclusions of science, the structure, cannot be more certain than the presuppositions of science, its foundations. You may have heard a time or two where we've made just that claim about pretty much everything else, and so we bristle at the whiskers for the underlying presuppositions of anything. But strong scientism rules out these presuppositions altogether, because the nature of the presuppositions is philosophical, just as defending the presuppositions is also a philosophical and not a scientific matter. Again, we covered that. It's self-defeating. In this way, then, scientism ends up losing the foundations of science itself, jeopardizing the entire edifice. One could almost say that it builds its house on sand and not on a foundation of, let me pull out like a rock or what have you.
Yeah, go figure, right? So the idea here is, let's say that we have the building of scientific knowledge claims, right? And then underneath that, maybe under the ground, are pillars that are holding up the building, right? And what he's getting at here is that the claim of scientism disregards, in fact, calls those pillars false, right? Because they're not scientific, they are philosophical. And if that's the case, then that seems somewhat absurd. So you're saying the foundation that holds up the building of science is false. Well, if that's the case, what does that do to the structure, right? It collapses, right? If the foundation, if what's holding up the pillars are false, then of course you don't have a good structure as well. And that's what he's getting at, right? And so he goes on, he says he's going to give us a list and discuss some of these presuppositions. So that's kind of interesting. In one of the books that he's written, he gives us, I think, like 10 of these, right? In this book, I think he only gives us like 6 or something, right? So we get cheated a little bit, but that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
And he says that not all scientists or philosophers of science agree with the entire list, right? And some do not think that science rests on presuppositions, but few would be in this latter category. Most scientists, he's suggesting, believe that science does rest on these kind of presuppositions, these foundation pillars that need to be the case in order to get science off the ground, we might say, right?
Right.
And so most advocates of scientism hold to a view of science that entails that science rests on most, if not all, of the assumptions that he's going to give us, right?
Yeah. So he says that he should also say that while he offers his own view about some of these assumptions, the issues before us is not which understanding of the assumptions is correct, e.g., which view of truth does science presuppose. And again, I point back to his introduction where he talks about starting out his life as a person who loves science, who still loves science, but then got into philosophy. So again, he's not diminishing the effectiveness of science, and he's calling for a more full understanding. But I think also to point out that he is the right person to kind of tackle this idea because of being able to offer kind of critiques or different claims within the list that he'll give us. The issues before us are these. One, the nature and content of the presuppositions are not scientific. They are philosophical. So the task of stating and clarifying each assumption is a philosophical and not a scientific one. Well, again, if you're strictly sole scientism, this one's going to be hard for you because you're not going to be able to even get off the ground. You're attempting to put the roof on to the house first, and that's not quite how it works. Two, the task of defending, criticizing, and offering alternatives to each presupposition is philosophical one and not within the competence of science. All right, well, we can't invite our scientism friends along for the first or the second task. Let's see if he'll be able to tag along for the third. The task of even arguing whether or not science rests on assumptions or on some specific one is not a scientific one either. It's philosophical. Fortunately, when it comes then to, we must turn to the neighbors next door, the philosophers.
Yeah.